Hey guys, Nathan here, Absurd Being on Kierkegaard. So, this is the first real video on the Kierkegaard series. As the title indicated, we're going to look at metaphysics, the metaphysical aspect of Kierkegaard's philosophy. And I'll just pull up that diagram for you quickly. And you can see that is, we're on the left side there. At the top there you can see the opposites. We're going to look at the first three. There's the finite versus the infinite, temporal versus eternal, and the body versus soul. Now, I've grouped those three together. I'll discuss why I did that in just a moment, but you can see that I've grouped them together, and if you follow the line down, the arrow down, it takes us down to the bottom left corner there, where we have the self or spirit, and anxiety and freedom as well. So we're going to look at those three aspects of Kierkegaard's metaphysics in this video. So the first thing I would point out, I guess, is metaphysics. Why are we talking about metaphysics? Kierkegaard in particular is quite critical of metaphysics, and in all of his works he's critical of metaphysical kind of speculation, or abstract speculation, preferring to deal with the actual and things that are real and existence, rather than these kind of abstract topics. And he doesn't call it metaphysics, so let me be clear about that. But basically it is metaphysical. I mean, he gives an account of how the self comes about, and the things that are involved in that process. And it is a metaphysical account. It's not central to Kierkegaard's philosophy, I guess, but it is kind of it forms kind of a bedrock layer, a foundational layer for everything that he builds on top of it. So it's not critical, it's not crucial, it's not what Kierkegaard focuses on a lot, but but he does talk about it, and I think it does set the stage for what comes later. So the opposites, those three opposites, I in the diagram, the finite, infinite, temporal, eternal, and body and soul, I've grouped those together because they're all similar, and they all kind of refer to the same thing. The finite, the temporal, and the body is like the it's earthly existence. It's kind of, we're in time, we're trapped in time. Finitude is defines us, as opposed to the infinite, the eternal, and the soul. And so those are all really, I mean, there is a religious connotation there, right? Eternal, soul, these have definite, an eternal soul is definitely what Kierkegaard's thinking of here, and divinity playing a role here. So that's basically the opposite. It's the finite earthly realm versus an eternal kind of spiritual existence. And he sees those two coming together in the self, and that's why I've grouped those three opposites together the way I have. But it's not just the synthesis of these three things, so don't get too locked onto that. The self, it's definitely finite, infinite, temporal, eternal, body and soul. It also, it's things like non-being, being, freedom, necessity, relative, absolute. These things, they all hint at the same. They're all operating within the same framework, which is that the kind of heavenly, earthly. I don't want to use that exact word, but that's the framework we're thinking of here. Something beyond corporeal existence, and as opposed to our existence in the body, in the world. So that's those opposites. So they are definitely religious for Kierkegaard, I believe, but you can squeeze some kind of non-religious slant, and I'll always be trying to do this with Kierkegaard throughout all these videos, trying to get from trying to strip the religious connotations, the religious implications from Kierkegaard, and give it some meaning that without any of that religious baggage. I mean, I'm not religious, I don't believe in God, but I think a lot of Kierkegaard's insights have merit, and they have merit even if in a secular sense. So I'll often be trying to do that, and you can kind of see something here. So we're talking about the finite and the infinite. So the finite and the temporal, that's our kind of mortal existence, our existence as a body, here and now, in this world, in this place. But then there is the infinite as well, where the infinite can be not necessarily just divine eternal soul, but perhaps like a transcendence of the corporeal through understanding. Our understanding gives us the ability to overcome our finitude in some way. We can't obviously literally be eternal or infinite, but our minds give us access beyond what our senses give us access to. So there is a way you can kind of secularize that idea, I think. Obviously you can't do it with things like soul and eternal. We're not eternal. We don't have souls, so it's tough to square those. But I mean, I think you can kind of walk a fine line here with Kierkegaard regarding that. So the first thing we're going to look at is the self. Okay, so the self. Let's have a look at this. Basically what happens, the self is just a synthesis of those opposites that I talked about at the beginning of the video. So in the concept of anxiety, Kierkegaard talks about the synthesis of the soul and the body. And when they synthesize, when they come together, we get spirit. He calls it spirit. Which he also calls it self, and spirit obviously has lots of religious connotations, self not so much, and that's the way I tend to think of it. It's just who you are. It's you. You are that synthesis of soul and body. You get spirit from that, or self. He calls this the first synthesis in the concept of anxiety. And there, because there is a second synthesis as well he talks about, and this is the combination of the temporal and the eternal. It's not really a combination, but it's the way that these two synthesize, the way they come together, and the middle term for this is also spirit or self. I mean, perhaps I'll just briefly mention it. The way that the temporal and the eternal synthesize in spirit gives us temporality, gives us the instant, and he says that it's because spirit is naturally or originally eternal, but when it posits itself, when it and when he says posits itself, it's like when it makes itself kind of concrete, then it naturally produces the instant, and then we're in the temporal. So that's the way it's not like two opposing realms kind of coming together and creating something. The spirit and the temporal emerges naturally from spirit positing itself as from an eternal spirit positing itself. I feel like I've overdone that. Anyway, we'll talk more about that. We'll talk more about the instant later when we get to temporality. but that's the main idea here. The self or spirit is a synthesis of these two opposites, soul and body, temporal and eternal. And the finite and the infinite is basically, it just covers, it's a general kind of category covering both of those syntheses, right? So let's have a look at the self in a bit more detail. And for this next section, I'm going to just work through the way he describes it in The Sickness Unto Death. He goes into quite a bit of actually it's a good section. It's at the very beginning of that book. And it's not long. I think it's on the first couple of pages. But he talks about the self in a really, I think, profound way, and Sartre, I think, picks up on a lot of this material. So anyway, let's get into it. Spirit or self, like I've already said, we don't have to worry too much about the religious implications there. It's just self. But what is self? So we described it as the synthesis. But in The Sickness Unto Death, he describes it a little bit differently. He describes it as the self is a relation which relates to itself, or that in the relation which is its relating to itself. So there's a little bit in there. Let's just have a quick look at that. The self is a relation which relates to itself. So it's not the relation. So we saw how there was the body and soul, the two kind of extremes or the opposites, and the self was the synthesis of those, or the relation, right? So there's the relation between those two, but that's not the self. The self isn't that relation. It's the relation relating to itself. So there's an element of kind of self-reflexivity there. And he goes on again, or that in the relation which is its relating to itself. So again, the key point is not that the self is a relation between two ideas, the soul and the body, for example, but that it's this relation relating to itself. So it's more like the relation kind of becoming consciously aware of itself. That's where selfhood originates. He also goes on to say in this, at the beginning of The Sickness Unto Death, the self-relating relation must be established by something else, which turns out to be God, and so it stands in relation to that something, to God. And this gives us the full relation which Kierkegaard thinks is the human self, or calls the human self. A relation which relates to itself, and in relating to itself relates to something else. So that's the full description. The diagram, I just made a quick diagram to illustrate this. So you can see there the soul and the body, two kind of those two opposites, and there's the relation between the two. The self is that relation relating to itself. So there's some kind of self-reflexivity, self-awareness, self-consciousness, and it also stands in relation to a something else, which is God. And you can see in that diagram, if you've read Sartre and if you've watched my videos, when I talked about presence to self, Sartre's idea of presence to self, the diagram I drew was quite similar to that central part where the self is. You've got this something, it was different in the Sartre videos, but you've got in here it's the relation, and then it's relating back to itself. So really, I mean, you can see the parallels here, the way that Sartre has made use of the profundity of Kierkegaard's insights. But again, he de-religifies them. You know, he takes out the religious implications and consequences. So it also occurred to me, you know, if we want to further take out some of this religious aspect, we had the relation to God, but we could perhaps substitute in there for God world. So the self is a relation relating to itself in the presence of the world, or in a relation with the world, and that gives us something more like Sartre's circuit of selfness. if you've read Sartre, so there are ways to get around this. We could body is quite clear, self, God as world. Soul is a problem though. That is a problem. There is no soul, and I think it's impossible to work that out, to finesse that, and secularize it. Soul is, I thought about something like mind, perhaps. Mind. But the problem is, there's no, the mind is kind of wrapped in with the self. You know, there is no mind and body meeting in the self. The self is in the mind. That's where all of the action happens, consciousness. So I can't see a way to fully to take this kind of this picture as Kierkegaard has outlined it, and just keep it in its entirety and just substitute terms. But there is something crucial, something important in that idea that the self is not something. It's not even a relation. It's something relating to itself, and from there, we can. Again, I just think I think it's a really important and interesting insight. So related to this, the self is it's kind of embodied in that diagram, the way that the self is relating to itself. The self is never static, is a kind of a consequence of this. It's always becoming, and that's going to be a really important point in Kierkegaard's philosophy. It's not a thing. It's not fixed, eternal, immutable. It's always dynamic, and that's something that really comes through in Sartre's philosophy. However, at the same time, it's always becoming, but at the same time, it's always something concrete as well. It's not an abstract concept. It's something real, i.e., this particular synthesis. It's not that It's not that synthesis or that synthesis over there. It's this particular synthesis which makes it concrete. As long as we keep in mind that it's also never fixed, never static. It's always becoming, always dynamic. In either or, he does mention, or he mentions in many places, I guess, becoming a self is not easy. So that's an interesting way to think about selfhood, right? We typically think about us where we're kind of born, we are who we are, right? We don't have to do anything to become who we are. We just, that it comes with the package, kind of. But Kierkegaard says that actually we don't get given a self for free, as it were. We have to become a self, and becoming a self is not an easy task. For him, the expression of this struggle is repentance, which we'll look at later. But it's just an interesting concept that I'll just wanted to mention here. We're not just given our selfhood. We have to work at it. We have to become ourselves. Another little point that I won't dwell on too much here is that the self is posited in what Kierkegaard calls a qualitative leap. And you will have heard of the leap, Kierkegaard's leap of faith. And and this is the same kind of idea. The leap is always qualitative as opposed to quantitative. So quantitative, when Kierkegaard uses that word, he means something that kind of progresses gradually, a change that happens over time as something. It's a cumulative process, right? You can do a little bit today, do a little bit more tomorrow, and you'll eventually achieve the goal. That's quantitative. Qualitative, though, is there are no intermediate steps. You just go from this level to this level. It's kind of like a quantum leap, actually. The particle doesn't traverse the intervening space. It just disappears from one place and appears in the other. And so that's what he means when he says that the self is posited in a qualitative leap. It doesn't happen in stages. It just takes place instantly. And because of that, there's no logical, reasonable, cumulative progression. Then it's inaccessible to science. This leap is inaccessible to any kind of scientific or rational explanation, and that is something that will come up again and again in this video series. What else do I have here? So we've got this idea, the self relation. That's what the self is. And how does this come about? What actually happens in this relation which relates to itself? That's what I want to look at next, and we'll do that in the section on anxiety and freedom. Okay, so we've looked at the way that, just to use one of the syntheses, body and soul synthesize in the self. That's where the self arises. And the self is not just that synthesis, but it's the synthesis or the relation relating to itself in the presence of God, for Kierkegaard. But what actually happens in that synthesis? How does that synthesis take place? I want to just drill in on that here in this section, anxiety and freedom. And anxiety and freedom will play a big role, which is why I've pulled them in here. The other thing I did want to mention just before I got into this was something, but I can't remember what it was. That's a problem. Okay, I'm just going to keep moving. I've got to keep going. So, in the state of innocence, that's what I was going to say. All of this material that I'm going to go through now is from the concept of anxiety. He really goes into quite pedantic detail, and it gets quite metaphysical. So we're going to descend into some fairly abstract waters. But anyway, let's do it. So in the state of innocence, the human is not yet spirit, Kierkegaard says. It exists in immediate unity with its natural conditions, and this is a peaceful state. It's peace, it's repose, there's tranquility, nothing is upsetting it. This is the state of innocence. But there's something else as well. Something else, something kind of in the corner of your eye you can catch. But it's not strife, because there's nothing to strive against. It's just something. It's just there's something you're aware of, kind of out of the corner of your eye, like I said. And what is this? It is nothing. It's nothing. So there's this kind of awareness, this a little bit unsettling. We're in peace, we're in tranquility, we're calm, but we're in the state of innocence, right? So it's all good, but there's something not quite right. What is it? It's nothing, because there is nothing, right? There's nothing to be worried about. But how can nothing be a cause of concern? Nothing is nothing, right? It's not something. It's not something to worry about. And what I would say here is that nothing is not something in the way that something is. Nothing is not something in the way that something is, but it can be something in a different way. So we're now looking at this idea of nothingness, which is very important to come to grips with. So perhaps I should say too that the way Kierkegaard's starting this story is from the position of Adam. So if you think back to Adam and Eve, Adam in the Garden of Eden, in a state of innocence, and I'll try and secularize this later, but that's kind of where we're at. So he's talking about the way that Adam sin entered the world. Actually, that's what the concept of that's basically what the concept of anxiety is about. So we've got the state of innocence, but Kierkegaard says that in that state of innocence, we're not yet spirit, we're not yet a self. It's completely peaceful, but there's something's not right. What is this? That something? It's a nothing, because there is nothing to upset us. But how can nothing be the cause of this discomfort? And the way that, so how can nothing kind of be something? And the way that I imagine this is, if you think of like a hole in the ground, a hole is literally nothing, right? It's non-ground. You've got the ground, and then there's this patch of no ground. It's literally nothing, and yet you will deliberately avoid it, right? You'll make sure that you don't step into it. So in that sense, the nothing is still something, but it's not something in the way that the ground is. It's not something, but it is something. So we've got this nothing that is provoking us a little bit of tension, a little bit of anxiety in us, and that is what Kierkegaard says here. This nothing begets anxiety. So it creates anxiety for us, and this is where anxiety comes from. So anxiety is different from fear. And this is a distinction that Heidegger makes as well, exactly the same thing. Anxiety is not, fear is fear of something concrete, something real, something tangible. Anxiety is anxiety about nothing, and that's what it is. Its object is always nothing for Kierkegaard. So anxiety is a specific kind of response, and it's a response to nothing. The definition that Kierkegaard gives us is: anxiety is freedom's actuality as the possibility of possibility. Now, we haven't slipped into being in time or being in nothingness, but you could just about be forgiven thinking that by looking at that quote. So what does that mean? Anxiety is freedom's actuality is the possibility of possibility. Well, hopefully I'm going to explain that now. So first of all, so the process here we're describing here is how a self becomes a self. How one becomes spirit from this innocent pre-spirit stage. Just how we get to to spirit, to selfhood. So first of all, Kierkegaard tells us one needs a spirit in order to be anxious. So the less spirit, the less anxiety. And this is why for him there is no anxiety in animals. They lack that, they lack whatever it is that humans have. Kierkegaard calls it spirit, but we could call it maybe a higher mental capacities, the cognitive faculties that we have. Whatever it is, that ability to of consciousness to kind of transcend oneself through being self-reflexive, whatever. Less spirit, less anxiety. So we need that spirit in order to be anxious. But then what is spirit? What is spirit? So we've talked about that already. The human being, synthesis of the psychical and the physical. But a synthesis is unthinkable if not united in a third. This third is spirit. So we've talked about that. That's what spirit is. So in innocence, we have, if you imagine Adam, in innocence the individual is ignorant and not yet spirit. So that synthesis hasn't been posited, if you like. The synthesis is thus not actual, Kierkegaard says. The combining factor of those two, the psychical and the physical, the combining factor is spirit. And spirit is not yet posited as spirit. So it hasn't, the way I read this is kind of like saying consciousness hasn't blossomed yet. It's more like a consciousness where one is aware of oneself, and where all of those special features of consciousness have fully emerged. That hasn't happened yet. And the way Kierkegaard describes that is this combining factor, which is spirit, is not yet posited as spirit. It's just there, but it's not self-aware, maybe. That's the angle I'm viewing this from. So he's basically saying that in innocence, an innocent ignorance, he calls it ignorance as well, is not yet a human being. The human being that is in innocent ignorance is not yet a human being. And he calls he calls this spirit which is not yet posited itself dreaming spirit. So bear with the kind of metaphorical language. But hopefully it will pan out in the end. So you've got this dreaming spirit or potential person, is one way to think about it. It's still different from the animal though. And that's because it is an ignorance, right, which is nevertheless characterized by spirit. And it is as such precisely anxiety because its ignorance is about nothing. So it's an ignorance characterized by spirit. So he's basically saying that there's like there's still the, I don't want to say potential, but that's close to what I'm getting at. There's the potential for the spirit to posit itself. Whereas in the animal, that potential doesn't exist. So there is, even though dreaming spirit is still not a human being, it's not an animal either, because there's that potential in it. So with all of this, I mean, I've encouraged you to think about this in terms of Adam, and that's the way that Kierkegaard presents it. But for me, this makes just as much sense if you think about the dreaming spirit being like an infant, a human infant, or a really young child, which exists in that same state of mind, right? It's completely, ignorance is bliss. It has no concerns, no worries, no fears. It doesn't fear anything because it doesn't know anything. So it's just this. It's just a momentary existence in the moment. A momentary existence in the moment. Anyway, it's just this state of kind of total ignorance, total innocence, and yet it has this slight anxiety from this nothing, which we haven't discussed in detail yet, but we're going to. So bear with me, but keep that analogy in mind. Think about Adam, but think that this can also apply to I think an infant or a young child. So let's look at the nothing. What is this nothing that causes this anxiety? That brings this anxiety out in the dreaming spirit, the spirit that has not yet posited itself as spirit. So what is this nothing? It is the possible. That's what the nothing is, the possible. The infinity of possibilities, in fact. In lacking any concrete expression is actually nothing. That's how Kierkegaard describes this. And in a way that seems fair enough to me, like all of the possibilities that are presented to us, there are an infinite number of them at any time. They lack any concrete expression, and in that sense they're nothing, not concrete, not being, nothing. That's no thing, right? So the nothing is the sense of possibilities that surround us. And the object of anxiety, as I've already said, is always nothing. And remember, we contrasted that with fear, which was always fear of something. And the nothing is the possibilities, which are literally nothing, no thing, non-being, nothing concrete, right? So again, well, we can just throw this back into the example of a human baby or infant or young child. Once it gets to a certain stage, it recognizes these possibilities before it. Perhaps not in full consciousness. It doesn't have full consciousness yet of all of these possibilities, but they're all there. It can do this, it can do that. Some things are good, some things are bad, some things will make it happy, some things will cause problems. These possibilities surround it. And so even though it hasn't yet fully become a self, it hasn't yet synthesized that spirit that we're talking about, that selfness that we're talking about, anxiety's there. Even though it's still in this state of innocence, anxiety's lurking, anxiety about nothing, about these possibilities that are there. And so anxiety is the awakening of freedom, which I think arises when spirit posits itself or becomes actual, i.e. when the dreaming spirit becomes spirit. And freedom is the realization then that being able is a possibility, being able to do something, do this, or instead of that, or do that instead of this, when that recognition, the recognition of that freedom that is part of being human, dawns on us, that's when the spirit, the dreaming spirit, becomes spirit. So let me give you another definition here as well. So anxiety is defined as freedom's self-disclosure before itself in possibility. So let's just have a look at this definition and see if we can make sense of this, given what we've covered. Anxiety is defined as freedom's self-disclosure before itself in possibility. So freedom's not a possibility. It's not the ability to do this or do that or do the other thing. Freedom doesn't mean being able to do all this stuff. It's prior to possibility. It's a prerequisite for possibility. You have to be free in order to have possibilities. Heidegger would say something like it's the ground of possibility. And that's where we are with this definition. Anxiety is freedom's self-disclosure before itself in possibility. So freedom becomes aware of itself in possibility, in the possibilities that surround it. So freedom is not, it doesn't belong to something, it doesn't belong to the self. It is the self. It's the self becoming aware of itself as freedom. So the idea is basically, after all of this, that even in innocence, the human being is conscious and intelligent and can therefore realize, here's another quote, freedom's possibility, the anxious possibility of being able. In innocence, the human being is conscious and intelligent and can therefore realize freedom's possibility, the anxious possibility of being able. And again, that's the idea there. The possibility that comes with freedom is not the freedom to do this or that, but the possibility, of possibility itself. So it's again, it's prior to possibility. It's the recognition that possibility exists for me. That's what we're talking about. So it's a slightly different understanding of possibility and freedom than you're probably used to. So let's have a look at the original quote then, which defined freedom, which defined anxiety. Anxiety is freedom's actuality as the possibility of possibility. So hopefully we can make some more sense of this now. Anxiety is freedom, which has become disclosed to itself as freedom. Freedom's actuality, so the way that freedom has become aware of itself, fully disclosed to itself as freedom, and its awareness of itself as the possibility of possibility. So the option, the freedom is not freedom to do this or that, but the freedom to have possibility in the first place, the freedom to choose in the first place, even before it chooses this or that. That possibility is what Kierkegaard's talking about with freedom. And anxiety comes from that because it's pressure. It's pressure. I mean, you've got all these possibilities around you. Which one? You know, the pressure that comes with being freedom, with having possibility thrust upon you, suddenly choice now. You have to make a choice. So that's why this is anxiety. And he goes on to distinguish between objective and subjective anxiety. I'm just checking my time there. He goes on to distinguish between those two, objective, subjective. Objective anxiety is, I don't really want to dwell on this at all. It's kind of a bizarre, again, he's talking about sin specifically. So he's trying to connect this idea with original sin and how that how that kind of works its way through the entirety of all, the whole human race, through or from Adam, how it's, and so that it's a really, I just can't make any meaningful sense of it. But like I said, I'll just mention it since it's there. Objective anxiety arises from being part of the human race, so it's quantitative. It's a cumulative process, and over time, this anxiety increases. And the way that I think that Kierkegaard's getting at here is when spirit posits itself in that synthesis. So when the self comes to be aware of itself as freedom in the sense of the possibility of being able, that possibility, or those possibilities, the possibilities that original possibility refers to are greater the further down the line you go, right? So the possibilities for us today are far more than the possibilities, say, of someone living 2,000 years ago. So in that sense, that anxiety, which he calls objective anxiety, is increased in that sense because the possibilities are just more numerous than they used to be. So that's the less important one, because it's well, I guess it's not really. That's a fair point. The freedom's possibility is greater today than it used to be. So the anxiety is greater in this objective, kind of cumulative sense, quantitative sense. So it's actually that's a good point. That is secular. We secularized that. Brilliant. So that's objective anxiety, and also there's subjective anxiety, which is more interesting in a way. This is more individual. It's related to the individual, as opposed to the kind of the individual in relation to the rest of the world or the rest of the external. It's more inward focused, focused on the individual. So in this sense, it's qualitative. It's qualitative as opposed to quantitative. And I'll give you a quote for this. Subjective anxiety. It is in this way that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom that emerges when spirit wants to posit the synthesis, and freedom now looks down into its own possibility and then grabs hold of finiteness to support itself. In this dizziness, freedom subsides. In that very instant, everything is changed, and in raising itself up again, freedom sees that it is guilty. Between these two moments lies the leap. Okay, so I do want to flesh this out a little bit. So let's just break this down. It's in this way that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom that emerges when spirit wants to posit the synthesis. I like the way that imagery, dizziness, like the anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. It's really seems to capture that idea nicely. That just how you can kind of feel what anxiety is, the dizziness of freedom. It's like, you're surrounded by all of these possibilities, and you have the freedom to choose any of them. You have the freedom of choice, and it's choice of these different possibilities. So the dizziness of freedom standing before that. So anyway, that's what anxiety is. The dizziness of freedom emerges when spirit wants to posit the synthesis. So spirit is again positing itself. It's that relation positing itself. That relation relating to itself. Or as he also says, spirit positing itself. Spirit positing the synthesis. And so that freedom now looks down into its own possibility, so realizes its possibility as freedom, as the freedom to choose, even before it chooses between this or that, just that raw original freedom, original possibility, and then grabs hold of finiteness to support itself. So it sees itself as freedom, and it's reeling from that insight, from that awareness, from that recognition. So it grabs hold of finiteness, it grabs hold of the temporal, grabs hold of the external to support itself. And in that you can see how the synthesis comes about between the finite and the infinite, right? The finite it's taken hold of by the self to steady itself, to find something tangible, grasp something to give it some balance, give itself some balance. And in this dizziness, freedom subsides. In that very instant, everything is changed, and in raising itself up again, freedom sees that it is guilty. Between these two moments lies the leap. So once that dizziness subsides, that sense of pure freedom dissipates, then everything's different. And when it reflects again after this original positing of the synthesis, then freedom sees that it's guilty. And we'll talk about guilt later. But between these two moments is the leap. That's the leap that Kierkegaard was talking about, that qualitative leap. There's no progression here. The self doesn't go from, to this stage, to the next stage, and the next stage. It's just that dizziness of freedom hits it, and then it the next moment that it looks at itself, after having grabbed hold of the finite, the next moment suddenly it's a self, it's posited, and now we have guilt, the opposite of innocence. So I've got a diagram which hopefully will summarize this a little bit. So on the left there you can see that we've got dreaming spirit, which is innocence, which is ignorance. It's that kind of potential person. And then spirit posits the synthesis, which is like becoming conscious, becoming self-aware. And then spirit, as freedom, becomes aware of its possibility and grabs hold of finiteness. So as it posits the synthesis, as it posits itself, it realizes that it grasps itself as freedom, and it understands its possibility, that original possibility, the possibility of being able, the possibility of possibility. And then, in the next moment, we have spirit, which is now guilty as opposed to innocent, and sees the world in good versus evil, in terms of good and evil, as opposed to its prior dreaming spirit, characteristic of ignorance. So you can see that there's the religious or the religious overtones are all through this idea, right? Guilt and innocent, good and evil, ignorance, the tree of, eating the apple from the tree of knowledge, knowledge of good and evil, Adam. It's all there. But I think that there's still a core here that is there is something interesting in this description. It's not just I don't feel like this is only an apology for Christianity. It's also something. There is something deep here about the way that Kierkegaard talks about the self as freedom and the possibilities that arise from that, and particularly the possibility, that original possibility, the possibility of possibility itself. So let's keep going. I've gone way over time on this, but I'm just going to keep going until I finish. There's no point in trying to break this up into 2 videos, I think. So I wanted to look at the future just briefly, since the possible always corresponds to the future, obviously. Anxiety is also always linked to the future. And I did find that interesting, because that, I don't want to say explains, but that's it's interesting that Heidegger always emphasized the future over the present and the past in being in time. And it's hard to see that not having something to do with this, Kierkegaard's position on this. So he goes on to say that if I'm anxious about the past, you might think, well, I can be anxious about something that's happened already, can't I? Well, Kierkegaard says if you are, it's only because that past, whatever it is, stands to you in the relation of possibility. So anxiety is always concerned with possibility. It's always concerned with nothing. And if you feel like you are anxious, and so it's always concerned with the future. If you feel like you're anxious about something in the past, it's because for you it has the relation of possibility, not something that's done and finished. And the example is a past misfortune, perhaps, which may possibly be repeated, something that went wrong but which might happen again, and in that sense it provokes anxiety. Or a past offence which you have not placed in an essential relation to yourself as past. So you're holding on to it in some way, keeping it alive, and it's that which is it's allowing that past offence to kind of manifest or to relate with you as possibility, rather than something finished and done and relegated to the past. So that's just a little bit about the future. So I wanted to move on and look at anxiety afterwards, after the self arises. So you've got the self, it's posited itself. Let me see if I can just run through this. So you've got dreaming spirit, which is it's in ignorance and innocence, but there is a sense of anxiety about nothing. And then through the process that we outlined before, where it posits itself as spirit, then it freedom awakens, becomes aware of itself as possibility, that original possibility, and then it's guilty and sees the world as a bunch of choices before it, some good, some bad. So what happens after that? What happens after that process is all played out? Well, Kierkegaard talks about Judaism, and the object of anxiety for Judaism afterwards, after all of this, is the nothing of guilt. And again, I don't want to get too much into that. We'll look at guilt later, but let's just throw that out there now. Since anxiety, let's just take that as read. The object of anxiety for Judaism is the nothing of guilt. Since anxiety is a dialectical relation to the nothing of guilt, positing a relation that is actual should alleviate anxiety. So you've got the situation, anxiety is a dialectical relation to the nothing of guilt, to the possibility, right? Nothing is always, anxiety is always about nothing, which is to say it's always about possibility. Then if you posit a relation that is actual, not possible, that should alleviate that anxiety. The problem here, though, is that the actual is an unwarranted actuality, Kierkegaard calls it, in the sense that it doesn't produce any kind of absolute, permanent actuality free from possibility and therefore free from sin and guilt. In every state, possibility is present, and to that extent, anxiety. So even though it might seem like it's easy enough to get rid of anxiety, which is anxious over possibility, by just getting something tangible, getting something concrete, making your relation, positing a relation that's actual, not based in possibility, turns out to be impossible, because however you might construct this relation, it's always going to be full of possibility. Possibility is always, it's an ever-present feature of human reality. And that actually is what I said right there. Anxiety is a permanent feature of human reality. And this has some nice correspondences with Sartre and Heidegger as well, right? In Bad Faith, we saw the same kind of thing for Sartre. We're always in bad faith. We can't escape it. It's just part of our natural condition. And for Heidegger was inauthenticity, falling prey. We can't avoid that. It's just what it means to be human. So anxiety is a necessary aspect of human existence. I did just want to quickly mention this dialectical. I threw that in at the beginning and I didn't define it, and it will come up again, and it comes up a lot in Kierkegaard, actually, dialectical. For a long time I had no idea what he was talking about. It took a while for me to really come to grips with it. So what I read was, since anxiety is a dialectical relation to the nothing of guilt. So dialectical is, if you think about dialectic, it means involving kind of opposite forces, to kind of interplay between two opposing forces. And basically for Kierkegaard, that's what it means. The setting up of two forces, but within the individual. So not external to the individual. So the anxiety is dialectical. it's a dialectical relation because it all happens within the individual, not external to the individual. So, for example, something like fear wouldn't be a dialectical relation because it goes outside the individual to something else, to something external to the person. Whereas anxiety it's internal. It's only concerning me because it's dealing with nothing. It's dealing with nothingness, right? An actual nothing, in the sense of in the sense of possibility. So there's nothing outside me which I'm relating to. It's all within. And when Kierkegaard talks about something being dialectical, that's what he means. This opposing force, but within the individual, completely inward. So we were talking about Judaism and positing something actual which we thought might overcome sorry, I'm just checking my time, which we thought might overcome this anxiety, which is rooted in possibility, but it doesn't, because possibility is always present. However, something has changed, Kierkegaard says, and what's changed is that when sin is positive, and I'm using the words sin and guilt, and we'll come to them later, but just let them kind of percolate for a while. When sin is posited in the single individual through the qualitative leap, the difference between good and evil is then posited. But now the object of anxiety is something definite. It's nothing, an actual something, because the distinction between good and evil is posited in concreto. And the anxiety has therefore lost its dialectical ambiguity. And that is what I was just talking about with the dialectical nature of this. So something has changed. It's no longer, anxiety is, now that spirit has posited itself, now that the individual has become a self in the true sense of the word, as Kierkegaard means it, and freedom has arisen, freedom as possibility before, as possibility of possibility, that original sense of possibility. Now that that's happened, and there's still anxiety over possibilities, what's changed now is that the anxiety has lost its dialectical ambiguity. So it's lost that pure inward relation. Yeah, it's lost its pure inward dimension, and now it's to do with something external. It's to do with something. If you remember that diagram, the good and evil. So it's to do with external things now, something concrete, not just possibilities. And in that sense, anxiety is now directed outwards. So no longer the anxious possibility of being able. Now it's the possibility of being able to do this or that. So now we've kind of climbed out of that original sense of anxiety to something where, so we can even say, is this even anxiety anymore? You know, anxiety, well, I guess it is anxiety in the sense that it's still about nothing, still about possibility, but it's no longer dialectical. It's no longer purely inward. It's no longer that anxious possibility of being able, the possibility of possibility. Now it's the possibility of this or that, good or evil, right or wrong. So now we've got concrete things outside of ourselves to refer to relate to. And so that's our anxiety there. And from here he goes on to say that we can be anxious about evil, and this leads to repentance, or we can be anxious about the good, which is demonic. And he calls that an unfreedom that wants to close itself off. We won't go into massive detail on that, but we will talk about repentance later. But yeah, let me just leave that there where we are. So hopefully that's kind of come full circle a little bit. Just as a couple of notes there to finish this little section on anxiety. Only faith can cancel anxiety, not by removing it, but by continually avoiding it. So again, anxiety is not something we can get rid of, but faith can cancel it by continually avoiding it. And we'll see how faith does that later. Kierkegaard has a nice way of putting this. There's no escaping anxiety. All we can do is try to be anxious in the right way. And that is through faith. And if we can understand our anxiety in this way, it will carry us to providence. We will be redeemed, I guess. It will lead us to salvation. So the last thing I've got is just a little bit about freedom. We've talked a lot about anxiety. We saw freedom arise in that synthesis, when the synthesis was happening, when the synthesis posited itself. But I just want to go into a little bit more depth on freedom. So, a definition: freedom is not something we have. That's important. We don't exist and then have freedom. Okay. Rather, it's foundational in the process by which the self becomes a self. So it's, in a deep sense, the self is freedom. And that is exactly what Sartre says as well later. And it's good to think about this too. Well, let me give a quote and then I'll talk about that a little bit more. So the quote: freedom is not freedom to do this or that in the world, but freedom to know with himself that he is freedom. The more he discovers freedom, the more sin's anxiety is upon him in the state of possibility. So that's basically what I've been saying, probably ad nauseum, right, again and again. Not freedom to do this or that, freedom to know with himself that he is freedom. So we are freedom. And it's interesting to think about this then. What can this possibly mean? Is this just words? Are these just words? What is this referring to? But I think when we're talking about freedom or the self, consciousness, we're not going to get there. We're not going to get to an understanding of this by looking at fMRI scans of the brain. We're not going to understand consciousness or the self by knowing what every atom in a person's brain is doing when they're conscious. That's not going to tell us what consciousness. We can only know consciousness from the inside, and this is a central aspect of Kierkegaard. Is we can only know subjectivity from the inside. Any attempts to describe it as a thing or attempts to approach it from outside, from an external perspective, a third person perspective, will always fall short. And we have to, when we're talking about the self, when we're talking about consciousness, it's something we can only describe from within. It doesn't make sense to describe it in any other way, because consciousness, the self, is lived. It's a lived experience. It's not a description you can read about in a textbook. And so when he talks about the self as freedom, it can be tempting to just write this off as flowery language that doesn't mean anything. But if you think about what is the self, it isn't a thing, right? It's not. I mean, the self is our conscious experience, and it's not something we can point to and describe in scientific terms. So when he says the self is freedom, that's a genuine description from the inside. It is what we are. We are freedom in this deep sense, not in the sense that we're free to do this or that, but this deeper sense that we are that by which possibility arises in the first place. And so I like this definition of the self as freedom. We are freedom. We don't have freedom. It's what we are. So I've also got a little bit here which I pulled from Either Or. So as we've seen, the self in the synthesis is freedom, but Judge William in Either Or, the second part of Either Or, also investigates the self, not at its inception in the synthesis, the synthesis positing itself, which we've talked about there, but afterwards, after this process has already taken place, and we've already kind of become a self in this original sense of the word. And what he talks about is the central aspect of the human being as freedom and as choice, and in particular the freedom we have in choosing absolutely. So he makes a distinction here of an absolute choice that exists. Even so, this is kind of still after this primordial choice. We've come to realize ourselves as freedom, and as the possibility of possibility. But even after that, there is still this absolute choice, which is the either or choice. And what he means by that is that whether we choose this or that, one chooses oneself in the choice. So that's something we'll talk about in more detail later when we talk about choice and decision. But I just thought it was good to note that here, that there is this absolute choice, which is still a central part of the self, and it's through this absolute choice that one actually chooses oneself, and there'll be more to say there. So what he describes, and when he describes the self, the freedom to choose, to make the absolute choice, to choose ourselves, when he describes the self as the most abstract and the most concrete of things. So what does this mean? Most abstract, the most concrete. Well, he says we never wish to choose to be a different person. No matter what we choose, what we might wish to choose, we never wish to be a different person. We always want to be ourselves, right? So there's something about us that remains absolute in relation to everything else. And this is the abstract component of the self, where there's an abstract sense of who we are, something absolute in relation to everything else. Because we always, no matter what we wish, no matter what we wish for, no matter what we would choose, it's always central that we remain ourselves. We don't want to be someone else, right? We might want to have what someone else has, or have the career that someone else has, or the things that they have, but we still want to be ourselves. So in that sense, the self is abstract. And he also says it's concrete. In what sense is it concrete? Because the self that we always choose is always a particular self, this particular self. So in that sense, it's concrete. So the self is the most abstract of things, but it's also the most concrete. And there's one more point I want to make before I wrap up, and that is the self must exist prior to the choice. So just think about that for a minute. So again, we've stepped away from this primordial synthesis in which the self becomes a self. We're now, say, an adult. Remember I talked about that process happening in kind of infancy or as a young child, where we first become a self. And now as an adult, perhaps, we're looking at the situation again. And here, we can still make this absolute choice. Even as an adult, there's still an absolute choice to be made in which we choose ourselves. But this absolute choice, when it's made, the self must exist prior to the choice, right? Or we don't have a choice, we have creation. But it must also not exist prior to the choice, or it's a choice between two finite things, and therefore not absolute. William, the judge, is still talking about this an absolute choice, the choice in which we choose ourselves. So it can't be. So the self must exist, or we're talking about creation, but it must not exist prior to the choice, or it's a choice between finite things, not an absolute choice. So he says, my choice is a choice of a self which already exists, but a self which is absolutely different from my former self because it is chosen absolutely. And that's not a quote, I've paraphrased that, but it's good, it's nice, right? It's good. My choice is the choice of a self which already exists, but a self which is absolutely different from my former self because it's chosen absolutely. This suggests like the choice is made with some resoluteness and passion and some conviction, right? It's a serious choice, not just a casual kind of choice of this or that. So I like that idea, and I just wanted to throw that in. Relates to the self, so I thought it might be useful. Now I just want to give a quick summary of what we've looked at in this very long video. So we saw at the beginning we talked about the self, which is a relation which relates to itself. It was a synthesis of body, soul, finite, infinite, temporal, eternal, those things coming together. And we looked in detail at how that process played out. We talked about anxiety, which was freedom's actuality as the possibility of possibility. We talked about anxiety versus fear, anxiety being anxious about nothing, whereas fear was always anxious about something concrete, something actual. Well, there it is. The object of anxiety is always nothing, the possibility. And that's what it meant. Nothing was possibility. And it's a permanent feature of human reality. We're always anxious because possibility is a permanent feature. And so just that original definition of anxiety, freedom's actuality is the possibility of possibility, that was what I called that original possibility, that sense of being able. That is what anxiety refers to in the original sense when spirit is positing itself. And then we talked about freedom, We had the possibility of being able. That was that root freedom. We talked about the self as freedom. The self is freedom. It's not something that the self has. It's what the self is. The nature of the self to choose oneself as well in that absolute choice. So this was the either or tack, which we'll look at in much more detail later. But still, that absolute choice in which the self chooses itself in that resolute sense, chooses itself absolutely. And this was prior to possibility. So the possibility of possibility, that by which possibility appears. And so that's basically where we are at. I'm going to finish up there talking, man, that's a long video. Anyway, I better get out of here before I run out of juice on my phone. My phone's just about out of battery power. So thanks for listening. I hope that's cleared some things up. I'll catch you in the next video. So see you then.